Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, one nation that could decide the U.S. presidential election, the Navajo Nation.
Data shows that most of the Navajo Nation voted blue in favor of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Arizona is a state with many independent voters and the largest Native American reservation. Now, it's also a top presidential battleground. So which way will it swing this November? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
There's a lot of uncertainty. The election is so narrowly contested right now. It's virtually a toss-up. The polls are showing that Vice President Harris and former President Trump are neck and neck in places like Arizona and all across the country. I'm Rob Reynolds, and I'm a senior correspondent at Al Jazeera English television, and I've been covering a lot of politics lately, especially concentrating on the state of Arizona, which is one of the battleground states in 2024.
Rob, welcome back to The Take. So you recently returned from that battleground state, the swing state of Arizona in the southwest of the U.S., and things got heated in the capital, Phoenix, after the last presidential election, from my memory. It was the beginning of the so-called Stop the Steal campaign. Men and women with pitchforks, guns, tiki torches, closed in on the county election office. How are election officials preparing for the November vote in light of that this time?
Well, it's nice to be here speaking with you again, Malika. Yes, in Maricopa County, that is the county and the voting jurisdiction that encompasses Phoenix and a number of other cities in Arizona, and it's one of the biggest voting jurisdictions in the entire United States. Back in 2020, when there was controversy and when then President Trump declared that he had won the election and that there was widespread election fraud, and a lot of his supporters showed up. And we spoke to a number of officials who experienced that, and they said how shocked they were and how uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking it was. Since that time, they've taken some measures to improve physical security, including a large iron fence around the entrance to the tabulation center and other sort of physical barriers. They've also in the voting center itself, they've said they've tried to tighten up and improve their systems to make it not only secure but also transparent, so that election observers from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, can all come in, observe the vote counting process, see that everything is above board, and that there's no cheating or skullduggery going on.
Yeah. So amongst the people you talk to, are there fears that could happen again?
There's certainly fears that it could happen again. I talked to a county supervisor in Maricopa County, Arizona, whose name is Bill Gates, no relation to the Microsoft billionaire. But Bill had been in office for 15 years. He's a lifelong Republican. And he said that because of his indirect responsibility for vote counting and election supervision in Maricopa County as a county commissioner, a member of the Board of Supervisors, he was subjected to an intense verbal and online campaign of vilification. Bill said, we used to be proud to, display on social media, our family activities. We'd go out, go on a trip, and we'd pose with our kids. And people were writing on social media and sending him messages with what he described as the most vile threats against his teenage daughters.
Oh, wow.
And it really left, an emotional scar. And he told me that, in his opinion, this sort of thing cannot go on year after year, election cycle after election cycle. At some point, democracy, Bill Gates said, breaks down. under the stress of these threats and this aura of violence.
Huh. So Arizona is one of 8 swing states. It has 11 very important electoral votes, and it's been a Republican state for many years. But in 2020, it went very narrowly for Joe Biden. And among the many groups, there is one group that helped get President Biden elected, and that is members of the Navajo Nation. So I want to play you something. This is Clara Pratt. She's the Tribal Engagement Director for the Biden campaign in 2020.
I think in the state of Arizona, we certainly could not have flipped it blue without the Navajo Nation.
The Navajo Nation is the largest reservation in the United States. So remind us what happened in the last election when it came to the Native vote.
Well, the Native vote in Arizona is important because in that state, the Native population as a whole is about 6% of the population of Arizona. There are several tribes, the Havasupai, who live in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the San Carlos Apache, the White Mountain Apache, the Hopi, the Tohono O'odham, who live down on the Mexican border and have been impacted by the border wall that was built during the Trump administration. But the largest tribe, with about 67,000 voters, is the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo Nation in 2020 came out and voted about 90% for the Democratic side, for Joe Biden. Wow. Now, remember, Joe Biden won Arizona by a little over 10,000 votes in 2020. So one could argue that the voters from the vast reaches of the Navajo Nation, a largely rural, largely desert, thinly occupied, non-urban area, could have been the ones who put Biden and Harris over the top 4 years ago.
Well, this September, Navajo Nation President Bu Nigrin was on Facebook urging the Navajo people to the polls.
Your vote can determine who sits in the White House and who serves in Congress. And for us, as the Navajo Nation, it matters. Whoever leads the country will work alongside them to advance the needs of our Diné people. Think about our elders. It wasn't long ago that they journeyed by wagons or walked for miles to cast their votes. They did this because they understood what it meant to be excluded from the process.
The Navajo are just one of 22 federally recognized Native tribes in Arizona and Indigenous voters outside of those. So does that mean a vote for Harris now, do you think?
Well, I mean, based on past history, it most likely does. As you mentioned, there are numerous tribal nations within Arizona, each with its own language, culture, traditions, religion, and political concerns and public interests. But the Biden-Harris administration has been attentive to the concerns of Native Americans around the country with the appointment of Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary.
A member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe of New Mexico, Holland's family traces back 35 generations on American soil, and like other Native American peoples, suffered centuries of mistreatment and neglect from the very federal agency she will now lead.
She's the first Native American person to head that cabinet post, which is important for policy regarding Native land. And also for things like expanding national monuments. In 2023, President Biden's designation of a vast area around the Grand Canyon as the Footsteps of Ancestors National Monument.
Today, I'm proud to use my authority under the Antiquities Act to protect almost 1 million acres of public land around Grand Canyon National Park as a new national monument.
This is a large area that's sacred religiously and culturally to several of the significant tribes in Arizona. And it had been possibly being exploited for uranium mining, for oil and gas exploration. And I remember talking to Diana White Dove Ukwala, a member of the Havasupai tribe, expressed to me, her great satisfaction that somebody was finally listening to the things that natives had been asking and demanding and agitating for generations.
This is a very sacred place, place of our beginning. That mountain right back here is very significant to us in our medicine.
Because this is a group that, overall in the United States is the poorest, the most likely to be unemployed, the most likely to have a great variety of difficult social situations. And of course, given the history of the seizure of their land, it's not at all surprising that they feel marginalized. So again, just seeing how Diana White Dove Ukwala was very satisfied with how their concerns had been addressed by the Biden administration, it would be surprising to me, given also that President Trump was not particularly supportive of Native culture or traditions or political priorities, that the Native vote would trend heavily towards Vice President Harris in this election.
I wonder if the campaign of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are doing enough to ensure that community is still shored up and not taking it for granted, since the Democrats got the vote in 2020. Do you think enough is being done right now?
We'll find out soon enough whether enough has been done from the perspective of the Harris-Walz campaign. But I will say that they are focusing on this group of voters.
I'm counting on your leadership, and I'm looking forward to our partnership in the context of your leadership. What you all are doing in your generation are so powerful, and you have everything at stake.
For example, they've got 20 paid staff members working on in the Navajo Nation and amongst other tribal groups to try and increase the turnout. There's a goal of increasing turnout by 2% at least for 2024. So they are active. In this election, as everybody has been saying for a while, every tiny sliver, demographic sliver of the U.S. population is potentially the game changer. So everybody, each campaign is trying to target people that they think might be a source of votes, and that is definitely true of the Harris-Walz campaign when it comes to Native Americans in Arizona.
In speaking with Native voters, did they talk to you about any of their issues and concerns? And I'm wondering, specifically given their history here in this country, if they're looking overseas at what's happening.
Certainly, you bring up an excellent point that Native Americans are intimately familiar in their history and in their family stories with the concept of genocide. So I can recall earlier this year being in Arizona to cover an event that Vice President Harris spoke at. It was before Joe Biden dropped out. There were pretty large crowds of young people protesting the war in Gaza and the Biden administration's policies and support for Israel, with a number of people holding up signs saying, tribal students opposed to genocide, some with the names of their own tribal nations on their signs. So it's certainly something that is on their minds, in their consciousness, and in a sort of sense of solidarity, perhaps, of understanding the concept of oppression and the concept of being outnumbered and being thrown off their own land.
After the break, the undecided voters in the Grand Canyon state. So, Rob, you mentioned every sliver of voters, this election are important because they could sway the election. And that includes independent voters, which is something that makes Arizona unique. There are a lot of independent voters in that state. Why is the state so seemingly resistant to the U.S. two-party system? Though, of course, they're not alone there. And what did people tell you about where their votes will land?
Yeah, we looked into this on a recent trip to the state, and speaking to some pollsters and political experts, they mentioned that there's a kind of residue of the old frontier spirit in Arizona voters, and a lot of them say that they're independent. They don't necessarily want to align themselves with either political party. They like to do their own research and make up their own minds.
Independence, we think, we rationalize, the principle, their ideas, and just everything, and then we decide.
One voter we spoke to at a farmer's market in the Phoenix area said, I really don't like either one of them. I haven't made up my mind, but it's crunch time now, and I have to decide who I will be able to live with for the next 4 years.
I'm never going to agree 100% with any of them. That's just me. I mean, there's a lot of things that one party, I really agree with them. And another party, I really agree with that. So it's not one or the other.
It's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the two-party
right.
system, And also part of this is generational because a lot of them are in the Gen Z cohort. That's people sort of born from 1997 onward.
I'm kind of more, in the middle. There's different issues on both sides that appeal to me.
Some of them are voters or first-time voters. And over the years, the strong party identification has waned, with each successive generation being less likely to strongly identify, say, my parents and grandparents were Republicans and I'm a Republican born and bred. In another sense, it expresses a dissatisfaction with the current political system. And I think you see that all across the country, not just in Arizona and not just among young people, but everywhere. People seem to be kind of unhappy about the way things are going.
Yeah. So we've been talking about voters. Let's talk about what they could be voting on, at least one of those hot button issues when it comes to Arizona, and that is immigration. Arizona shares a border with Mexico. Former U.S. President Donald Trump and now candidate keeps talking about mass deportations once he's in office. But I wonder if that's having an effect and an impact now, these issues related to immigration on voters that you talk to.
Yes, very definitely. It has resonated with the more conservative-leaning or Trump-leaning voters in Arizona. But beyond that, if we look outside of the presidential race of Harris versus Trump, there's also a ballot initiative in Arizona, initiative number 314, that would change the law to allow, to make it a crime, essentially, for people to cross the border into the United States, into Arizona at any place other than a designated border port of entry. And that would allow local police to arrest people and charge them with a misdemeanor, and repeat offenders could be jailed for certain length of time.
Rob, let me pause you there because I just want to make clear, especially for our international viewers and listeners, and even for some of our American ones, police are not usually in charge of cross-border activity. That's not their domain. And so this is effectively putting it into the hands of police officers to make the determination that someone has crossed and thus is liable for a crime.
Exactly. This is on the ballot, and it's wildly popular. I mean, there's like over 60% of the people, according to polls, again, with a caveat about polling, we all know that it's more or less reliable. But there's a large majority in favor of this ballot initiative. It would give power to local police in Arizona, not only just down by the border where there's a big fence and where people do cross from Mexico, but all over the state, up in the north, in Flagstaff, hundreds of kilometers away, they could arrest someone if they had suspicion that they were in the country illegally. On the other hand, on the flip side, Vice President Harris, when she's questioned about immigration issues or the border, she always flips it around and talks about how there was legislation that was put together on a bipartisan basis in Congress to strengthen the border and give more money to border enforcement and so forth, and that was torpedoed by Trump.
Arizona also has a large Latino population, many with ties to Mexico. So I wonder what their thoughts are on these laws, because you said they're overwhelmingly popular and look very likely to pass.
It might surprise people to learn that the Latino population in the United States generally, and in Arizona as well, is a diverse group of people with concerns like all other voting groups. They don't vote on one issue only. When I speak to Latino voters and advocates for Latinos, they say that they want to be taken seriously by both candidates. They don't want to be taken for granted. And in the case of the Democratic Party, not to simply assume, well, they're a minority group in the country, so they're going to vote Democratic. That's not necessarily so. And we're seeing that to a certain extent in some of the peeling away of Latino votes that, according to pollsters, are going towards former President Trump. Still, about 60% or more of Latino voters nationwide and in Arizona are generally considered to be pretty loyal Democratic voters and will probably wind up supporting Harris. But just like everything else, Latino voters' attitudes are shifting in the country. I also talked to Latino voters in Arizona who surprisingly are in favor of harsher border crackdowns. They feel that perhaps their own economic status or otherwise is at risk because of an influx of undocumented migrants from beyond the border.
Wow. Well, finally, Rob, I know that you'll be back in Arizona shortly and then back again for the election itself. So at the risk of asking you to look into your crystal ball, what are you expecting come Election Day?
I'm expecting Election Day to be very busy. There's going to be a big turnout. I think it's going to be driven not only by the presidential contest in Arizona, but also by another ballot initiative that would enshrine in the state constitution women's reproductive rights and the right to an abortion. We are prepared to be there for several days at least afterwards, and we're going to be outside the Maricopa County Voter Tabulation Center, and hopefully things will be peaceful, but I think it's going to be a couple of long days, Malika.
And that's The Take. What will you be doing November 5th? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like conversations like these, give this episode a thumbs up. And remember to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English channel here on YouTube.